you are overqualified, yaar. Your MPhil is from Oxford University. You worked in the World Bank. Then you were a research assistant in the Institute of Fiscal Studies in London. Uske baad, you want to become DM or a collector or something in some godforsaken Nagaland. You answer my question. Why you don't like economics? You're from one of the best colleges of India, Sriram College of Commerce, but it is also good in economics. And such a bright fellow, why do you want to waste your talent?
Sir, thank you so much for your kind words, first of all. I've thought about this over the last couple of years. I have enjoyed doing research. I still enjoy doing research and within economics. But I also think that I really want to be based in India, work on issues of governance at the grassroots level, because over time I realized that there is so much of new research we are producing, but it's of no use unless it is implemented well on the ground. And I feel that there is some scope to positive work over there, and I would like to bridge that gap myself. But let's see how things go.
You heard of this lady Geeta Gopinath?
Yes, I have.
You met her in Washington or?
I didn't get the opportunity, sir.
There is a distinct possibility that if you continued in those the previous career paths, you would end up maybe like Geeta Gopinath, or even better, Christine Lagarde. What's the name?
That is very high praise, sir. I'm not sure if I deserve it, but thank you so much.
You see, Raghuram Rajan, if he followed his father, he was an IPS officer, and became an IPS or an IAS, nobody would have noticed him. Do you know that he's a B.Tech? Yes. He's not an economist. He became an economist. You have heard of this Raghuram Rajan?
Of course, sir.
So, anyway, now that you have chosen to join us, welcome. You will not have any difficulty. We'll tell you how to impress the board. I hope you are reasonably in touch with Indian affairs, because you left India quite some time ago.
That's true, sir, but I also came back last year. I've been in India for the past 17, 18 months since the pandemic started, basically.
Okay, then my colleagues in the panel will grill you, and let's see.
Thank you, sir.
I will now hand you over to the former Chief Secretary of Telangana State. If you do enter this IAS, the highest point is the Chief Secretary. Of course, an odd man once in 2 years may become even Cabinet Secretary, but we will all be happy if you become a Chief Secretary. So let us see how you will be groomed by Dr. M.G. Gopal. Gopal Gar.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. SARTHAK. Do you hear me well?
I can hear you, sir.
Yeah, okay. Now, you are from Haryana, and you would have heard of a legislation called the Right to Services Act in Haryana.
So I will just plug my earphones. Sorry,
yes.
I will probably do better this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
you are from Haryana. You are from Haryana, and you have been here for quite some time, maybe a year and a half. Have you heard of a legislation called the Right to Services Act in Haryana?
I am not familiar reading or listening about it, sir. But if I have some more context, hello.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Even if you haven't heard of Right to Services Act in Haryana, you would have had some interface with the government offices in some capacity or the other, or your family members would have had some problems, you know.
Yes,
so
sir.
I would like to know what needs to be improved in the service delivery in Haryana state in general and Gurugram in particular, when compared to the service delivery in, say, the places where you live, London or Washington or whichever is the place.
Certainly. So I think there are 2 or 3 things that we need to do much better compared to what happens in Western countries and in general what we can achieve for. The first thing is ease of reaching the government. It shouldn't take a lot of time for citizens to petition the government, get things done. I think that's the first thing, to make the process much smoother and much kind of quicker. The second thing would also be greater use of technology. For instance, when we would kind of have some problems in London, one of the easiest things would be to just track our request and track everything online to see how things are going, where our application is held up. Thirdly, it is related to what I said in the second thing, the interface between the administrators and the concerned citizens. I think it would be kind of as less would be better because of some particular concerns we face in this country due to corruption and so on. Fourthly, there is also, I think, a great possibility, and that's something I noticed especially in Gurugram, for citizens to get a lot more involved in kind of helping administrators figure out what is the problem and how things can be solved. I mean, in back over there in London and in other places, there is this great concept in which you can very easily submit requests in that if a road has been damaged or something else is going wrong, if a public park is not safe, and things get acted upon. So by and large, these are the things which I think are important.
Okay. Now that you mentioned that you need some opportunity to convert your research findings into actions by the government, and you are also interested in research in education. Now tell me, due to COVID, as it is, there is a divide between the rich and poor as far as education levels, literacy percentage and standards are concerned. And because of COVID, it got further accentuated because, maybe 50-60% of the population, they are not connected to, internet, and, the kind of bandwidth that is required is not available. So how do you, first of all, fill this gap, which has arisen because of COVID, which, many people are also referring to these days, if you are posted as district magistrate of a district in Haryana?
So first thing I would try to ensure is that we need to do things differently now after the pandemic. The focus so far on getting more marks and clearing exams and so on becomes less important because kids are obviously much behind in terms of learning outcomes, which is the most important thing. So that's one kind of shift I would like to encourage. The second thing would also be getting kids back to school. I mean, there is some evidence that around 40% of kids, there's a reduction of 40% in private school enrollment in Haryana in this year. And whether that takes cash incentives, whether that takes more counseling or better facilities for kids, I mean, it's very important to get those kids back. Thirdly, I think there would also be required some greater emphasis on remedial classes, on kind of basically kids getting back to the levels on which they were before the pandemic. And there is scope to recruit people from the community, educated youth, for instance, even hire more teachers. All of that would require more money, obviously, but I think it is needed in the education sector after the pandemic. And fourthly, just one final thing, we have noticed that technology has been extremely useful during COVID, but it hasn't been available to everyone. I think one of the most cost-effective decisions any government can take is, and I think the Punjab government did that, was to provide low-cost tablets, internet connections to poor children and help them bridge the digital divide.
Okay. But would you not like to focus a shift from the content-based or curriculum-based rote learning type of education to some kind of a skill-based education and imparting of skills, making use of this crisis and converting into an opportunity?
So I would favor that, but I would do so for some higher classes. I mean, my kind of suggestions were mainly for primary school students who have also been hit the most.
So how will you deal with the higher classes?
So as you pointed out, and as several experts have pointed out over the recent kind of last few months, is that the pandemic has also been a great learning opportunity for our children. I mean, they've seen their parents, they've seen their families experience hardship, they've often had to do some work of their own. And those are the kind of skills that, I mean, it wouldn't be ideal if you just completely ignore those learning. So when kids come back to school, I think some time can be taken out from the regular classes, from the rote classes as we spoke about, and focus on what the kids learned during the pandemic, whether it was aspects that a particular child is most attuned for. And I think in combination it might help.
Now you worked in the World Bank group, and are you conversant with the procurement procedures of World Bank? What are the salient features of procurement procedures?
So I haven't had the opportunity to do that in great detail, but I have had several conversations with people who work on loan portfolios. So maybe I can answer based on that experience.
Yeah, please tell me, because earlier, prior to the World Bank entering in a big way in a country like India, when a contractor was to be paid, he was paid for the materials collected and dumped on site. And there is some improvement, that has taken place where for some completed work, payment was made. Then you had the World Bank discipline, and they were being paid based on the outputs, etc. Now, the new concept, I do not know, I am not in touch anymore, but you must tell me with your experience, payment based on results, pay for results, how is it working? Particularly in social sector programs.
So it is an attractive concept to start off with, because for very long we focused on the inputs, and payments and everything has been focused on how the inputs are once they are sourced, but there's been less focus on the outputs, for instance. I'm not 100% sure of whether it's working successfully or not, but in theory I can see that it is an attractive concept. But at the same time, the crucial thing, which is how you measure results, who is the agency that is measuring the results? Do they have an incentive to over-report? Do you have mechanisms to check those reporting and so on? I think these will be important concerns in this kind of model.
Okay. Now, I have seen, in late 90s and early 2000, that the country assistance strategies of the World Bank were basically focusing on, some kind of privatization of utilities, especially relating to water supply and sewage. Now, they tried, at different places. Manila experiment, is an example. Now, has the focus been shifted in the country assistance strategies now, or is it the same?
So as far as I am aware, there has been some shift. The World Bank's Washington consensus dominated thinking of the 90s has, I think, fallen slightly offside over the past few years, and especially, I think, due to the pressure by low-income countries, and also due to the rise of Chinese loans. So the World Bank can no longer be the unmatched kind of competitor in the market. As far as privatization of utilities in particular is concerned, I'm not 100% sure if they are still recommending that or if they stopped recommending that, but I have seen documents in which the World Bank still talks about the merits, and also, for instance, share some examples of discoms in India, where the privatized ones are probably doing a bit better than those still in the hands of the government. Okay.
Do you think the present focus on, straight away disinvesting in public sector is one of the conditionalities of the World Bank Group in India?
I don't think so, sir. I think that our engagement with the World Bank has fallen very precipitously over the past couple of decades. We are no longer, we're no longer doing the kind of business we once used to. And also the bank is no longer in a position to command us to sell our national assets just for getting some $1 billion.
Okay, tell me, what is the FRBM Act?
So the act was passed in 2003 when fiscal deficits were very high, both in center and states. The act, in particular, when it was passed, had this kind of provided this kind of path over the next 4 or 5 years to bring down fiscal deficit of the center to 3% and stabilize debt to GDP ratio of the country at 60%. But that has kept on being postponed, even though states have also come out with similar legislations. And after the pandemic, now it's completely fallen haywire, and there is reports that the center is mulling a new FRBM Act.
But the center themselves have permitted the states to borrow additionally over and above the earlier limit of 3% to say about 5%, subject to achieving some milestones in some of those reforms programs. So can you tell me what are those conditionalities insisted upon by the union government?
So as far as I remember, the 3% was allowed to everybody. Then a 0.5% I think was also given to all states. Then the next conditionalities were implementing reforms in the power discoms, which were facing huge losses. Then there was the One Nation, One Ration Card implementation that was also being stressed upon. There's supposed to be one more, but I can't remember which one it was.
Okay. Ease of doing business.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. And urban sector reforms, which I think, okay, all right. Now, there is some criticism, if you have noticed, that some of the states are trying to circumvent the provisions of FRBM Act And in order to push investment, in capital expenditure, they are creating special purpose vehicles and borrowing, by giving guarantees to such parastatals or to such SPVs, so that they could borrow through the parastatals and get the money back to the state coffers. Now, to what extent you think this is a real circumvention of the FRBM Act?
So, just to kind of add a preamble, the center had also been doing something very similar as far as the food subsidy was concerned, putting all the money in, kind of borrowing it from the Small Savings Foundation and so on. I think there's this famous Goodhart's law that whenever an indicator becomes too important, it fails to become an important indicator. So I think the important thing is to look at the deficit in a very holistic manner. If we are very concerned about keeping deficits and debts low, then this kind of circumventing, offering guarantees to agencies, which is ultimately money coming out from the exchequer at the end of the day, I think that kind of accounting must be relooked at if we are very careful about keeping our debt manageable.
No, is that kind of management in principle wrong or technically wrong?
Sir, could you please repeat the question?
Is that kind of additional resource mobilization, technically wrong, or in principle it's wrong?
So I do not think it is technically wrong, because I think states, as far as I'm aware, they have been successful in kind of circumventing it that way. But in principle, if you look at the broader objective of keeping fiscal deficit below 3%, then I think it kind of deserves a stern word.
Okay. Now, before I pass on to my co-panelists, you please tell me, there has been criticism that, there is a double taxation as far as fuel is concerned. For petrol, we pay excise duty, we pay, VAT. And why is the government of India is not able to, make states fall in line by, creating some carrots for them?
So, in fact, that is something I wrote about in a recent article for the Financial Express, and I wrote about the carrot that the state can offer. And the carrot I mentioned was the fact that basically right now the devolution that happens out of the central pools doesn't include the cesses and surcharges due to a provision in the Constitutional Amendment Act. And I argued that Article 282 can be amended to also give the states those funds, and in return they can have these kind of things also coming into the GST, so as to placate the states of concerns around lost revenue.
So would you like to, create a model, financial model, as a next step to convince the states and the central government to, agree to this kind of recommendation that you said you have made somewhere in an article?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to kind of do more number crunching on that. But I think in principle it seems feasible, because the states are also deprived of revenues due to cesses and surcharges. And basically states have very less money to work with in our current system. So I don't fault them for wanting to conserve their autonomy with taxes on fuel and so on.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hello, Sarthak. Good to see you here.
Good evening, sir. Same here.
Evening, yeah. You are from Haryana, and your state has a policy of reservation for locals in private sector jobs. What is your take on that issue? How do you look at it? Since your interest is also there in public economics, political economy. These are your areas of interest. So, as someone interested in these areas, how do you look at this policy?
So I can understand the politics of the move, because unemployment in Haryana has been very high, especially after the pandemic now. But coming from an economic angle and coming from even many more angles, I do not think this kind of policy is either beneficial or something that should be done by a state in our country. Because the idea of India is to have a unified market where people can move across from one state to another. And I come from Gurugram, a district that has gained massively from influx of people from various states. And I think at the end of the day, if the competitiveness of the state, of the district loses out, then basically everybody would be worse off. Firms are already talking about moving to other destinations. And in response to that, there has been some positive movement by the government in that they said they're looking into those concerns and might even act upon them.
Has there been any evaluation done so far, and what have been the results?
So I haven't seen any evaluation yet. So I possibly cannot comment on this, I think.
It looks like the response that you have given me comes purely as a kind of a theoretical proposition.
So partly it does. We have seen experiences of, I mean, we might not have evaluated this particular measure, but there is plenty of evidence from the economics literature from India and abroad that when you create segmented markets like these, firms which are especially in need of low paid labor, they are and I mean they are very kind of mobile in the sense that they can easily shift across the border or hop onto another state. And I think those are persuasive concerns that need to be taken into account while making this policy.
No, but just for sake of argument, or perhaps to engage in some kind of a discourse. Now, what's wrong in having some kind of a threshold for these jobs? Why should someone perhaps in a driver or some lift operator should come all the way from say Bihar, Odisha to Haryana? Why not at least some kind of a threshold approach can be adopted?
So there is no need for people from Bihar and Jharkhand to come to Haryana, but they do so because of lack of proper employment opportunities. What we are basically doing, I think, even if we have a threshold, for instance, right now 50,000 rupees, or even if that's lowered, first of all, we are doing something that is against the interests of the poorest people of the country. Also goes against what Mahatma Gandhi advised us to do. People from Jharkhand, Bihar are probably more impoverished than people living in the state, which is doing a bit better. Secondly, sir, even if we create a threshold, then firms have complained of skill shortages. And as we are all aware that India's labor market is beset with skilling problems. That's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to develop our manufacturing capacity. If we want to make it even more difficult for companies to tap into, say, for instance, skilled drivers coming from Delhi or somewhere else, then I mean that doesn't bode well for anybody in this kind of scenario.
No, anyway, that's a matter. In any case, since there is no particular empirical study or anything, one can only talk the theoretical aspects of this particular policy. Perhaps. By the way, how old is this policy?
So in Haryana in particular?
Yeah, in Haryana.
So if I understand correctly, it was legislated in last year, perhaps. Maybe I think it could have been an year almost, if not a bit more.
Perhaps we might be thinking it's too premature to make a study and come to some kind of a conclusion. Anyway, we'll leave that stage. And in recent times, some states are contemplating putting a cap on population. Uttar Pradesh, then Assam. The recent one to join the bandwagon is Uttarakhand. I really don't know whether Haryana would also fall in line. But be that as it may, there is also a bit of skepticism about this move. Tell me, as a political economist and also as a researcher, how do you look at this proposed move to bring in a legislation to put a cap on population per family, number of children, and so on?
So I feel this flies in the face of whatever evidence we have accumulated of India's fertility levels already coming down. We are at 2.2, we were at 2.6 a couple of decades ago, and it's gradually coming down as well. Secondly, we have also seen the impact that has happened to countries like China and other countries that have tried to artificially control their populations. And I honestly believe that in the 21st century, the challenge would be for all countries to have more number of people rather than less number of people. So in that way, we're also doing something, I think, that is not long-term. There are obvious problems of impact on child sex ratio, and that is particularly concerning for a state like Haryana if you mandate these kind of things. There's also concern of what happens to people who have already had those children? Why should they be disadvantaged when the policy has come just now? They might also be the poorest people. I can understand the politics behind it. There is a lot of pent-up concern in the middle classes and other people that our population levels are too high, which I think partly reflects understanding from 2 or 3 decades ago. And there have also been some more sinister explanations of these kind of moves that revolve around communal concerns and sectarian concerns. And so I think this is a policy that is best studied a lot more before it's implemented.
So in some, this incentive kind of measures that are built into this particular policy are not going to pay off. Is that what you are trying to conclude?
So I would think so. I mean, my objection with the policy is broadly that these kind of measures do not really succeed in bringing down fertility, as opposed to just things like, for instance, women's education that has been proven to be very successful in reducing fertility.
Now, in India, we are also now currently concerned with the assessment of 3 decades of economic reforms. And there are also people who are saying, yeah, we succeeded, but they're also saying, some people are saying it is halfway, it is not full throttle, and so on. Have you had any opportunity to make an assessment of the successes and failures of 3 decades of Indian reform process? And what is the way forward? What would be the thrust area? Suppose if you are consulted, to give policy inputs, what would be that, and which areas would you think the present regime should be focusing on?
So first of all, talking about the positives, I think there have been many over the past 3 decades. We have grown a lot faster than we ever used to. Poverty has fallen very fast, second fastest in the world, in fact. It has also generated resources for the state to implement programs like Manrega, NFSA, and so on. And it has also given rise to a very dynamic kind of system, dynamic economy in which we are very good in things like IT and trying to develop an entrepreneurship culture in our country. Coming to the downsides, one of the outcomes has been higher inequality. Our Gini coefficient and however we measure inequality has risen after the reforms. The supposed benefits to manufacturing haven't really took place. Our share of manufacturing in GDP remains by and large constant. Coming to what can be done going forward, I honestly feel that those reforms weren't taken to their logical conclusion. There are still some sectors that are in dire need of reforms and probably would benefit from the state having a smaller role. India is an exception in the world when we look at the share of the state in bank ownership, for instance, and that's something that can be looked at. And secondly, I would advocate that even if we go a bit more free market in this direction, the state has to play a major role in providing public goods like health and education, on which it hasn't done very well since independence, for that matter. Developing strong safety nets so that if people are left out of the market system, then they have something to bank upon. Things like Narega is an excellent example of that. So I would conclude by saying that we need a revisal in the role of the state, which started with 1991 but hasn't come to its conclusion. But I do not want the state to dissipate or anything like that, which some of the commentators in favor of the reforms would argue for.
No, during election time, there are lots of freebies being announced, and at the same time, there is also a very thin dividing line between what is a freebie and what is a welfare mission. Now, by applying what criterion do we actually distinguish between a freebie and a welfare?
So, what do we distinguish between a freebie and
a welfare? What is the distinction? Because the dividing line between the two is really very hazy, and also because of the kind of political environment we have in this country, it is rather difficult to distinguish between something which is freebie and. But tell me, as a political economist, what is that crystal clear line which we can, or some kind of a criterion by which we can say, yeah, this is freebie, this is welfare?
So I agree with the characterization that it is extremely difficult to draw a line between these two things, because often we fall into the supposition that just because something is provided to the poor before an election, it has to be a freebie, when it's not the case. If I am pushed to make a line between the two, I would probably stress on some kind of freebies that are definitely not in the best economic interest of the country, and I mean, ultimately kind of harm our culture. For instance, to give you an example, something like farm loan waivers. We do have better alternatives to benefit the farmers, especially the poorest farmers who don't even take out the loans. But having these kind of farm loan waivers, it distorts the credit culture. It has a number of other problems. I would probably classify them as more of a freebie than a welfare, because I think there are better ways to target the welfare in that capacity.
I'm sure you have also heard of Startup India program in our country, and an ecosystem is also being created about startup in our country. Now, how do you see its potential, and what are the problems of Startup India campaign?
So the government has taken a number of praiseworthy steps, including setting up a National Startup Advisory Council and basically kind of reducing the compliance burden of new companies. I think the potential is very high. We've already seen two models, two cities coming up as startup clusters in the country. The first being Bangalore, and the second being Gurugram, which is fast displacing the first one. I feel there is a lot of potential because of our skilled population, our population which is very highly educated, coming from the best colleges of the country, and they are the best minds. That's something nobody can doubt. Coming to the constraints faced by these startups, one thing we have seen is a relative lack of pure innovation. That's something that we see in the US a lot more, for instance. And countries like China and India have probably done more of the copycat thing, but that's not necessarily wrong. But I think going forward, if we have to be much more competitive, if we have to be dynamic global leaders, then the state also has to do more in investing in research and innovation that startups can tap into. Seeing as an economist, there is a great potential for sharing data by the government to new fledgling companies that can be used for making profitable business models. And finally, we have to be very careful not to burden them too much with their kind of regulatory requirements, when they list on IPOs and so on. And I think these combinations might help make us.
But do you have any idea what is the success rate of startups?
So
some intuitive figure. I'm not really asking for hardcore statistics, but some intuitive figure. And if you look at startup scenario from a distance, let's say some kind of an intuitive feeling, yeah, it's doing well, or no, it's not all that rosy. What is the kind of gut feeling you have?
So by definition, startups would fail more often than they would succeed. So I don't think the success rate would be higher than a few percentage. But one of the biggest examples I can see where startups are succeeding, for instance, is when we watch the IPL. Most of the advertisers now are no more the old DLF and Pepsi. All we see is Paytm, Byju's, My 11, Dream 11, and so on. So I think this is showing that our startups are doing well.
Okay, that was interesting talking with you.
But
before I wind up, since you were also briefly in UK, I was just interested in knowing what has been the impact of Brexit on India. Are we the gainer? Are we the losers? Where do we stand?
So by and large, I think Brexit has been beneficial for India, and that for a few reasons. Since I studied in the UK for a couple of years, I know that we were earlier disadvantaged compared to EU students, but now we are at the same platform in terms of funding and so on. And the same goes for getting jobs, of which there are many people going to the UK. Secondly, the UK has also been very ambitious, very anxious to forge new trade deals, and it has been wooing India for the past some time because it can no longer rely on the EU as it did previously. And thirdly, the economic impact of Brexit on the UK has also been less than what some people feared initially. So I think a strong UK economy also bodes well for UK-India relations. and more trade and more capital investment can also happen now.
So are we now better positioned to export, to do more exports and less imports? What is going to be the trade balance between the two countries?
Precisely, sir. I think there is some more work to be done for that. Our goods still face high trade barriers, and especially our services exports. There has to be an easier regime for our students that go and get jobs in those countries. But I think after the trade deal and the agreements are signed, things will get better.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Mr. SARTHAK Agrawal.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Recently, the Delhi High Court gave an observation that the promises made by the Chief Minister in press meets, they should be taken as the law and they are to be implemented. So they are not promises just like they are given at the time of the election manifestos or maybe election meetings. Now, this observation is very, very significant. So what is your view? So should it be replicated in all the states and the even Supreme Court also?
So if I could just request you to clarify, the Delhi High Court said the promises made in which capacity are supposed to be implemented?
The Chief Minister in the press meet, whatever promises they made, they are to be taken as the schemes granted by just like an assembly. So they are to be implemented. So they are not like mere promises. So on that thing, so what is your view? And whether it can, the Supreme Court should also give such type of direction so that the empty promises can be controlled in the country. What is the view?
First of all, I'm not in favor of High Courts and Supreme Court getting very much involved in the daily kind of executives functioning. If promises are not kept, then there is a mechanism for that, for the politicians to be held accountable, and that's periodic elections and other kind of mechanisms that exist in a democracy.
Yes.
And for that same reason, I would say that just saying out a promise, just saying something doesn't mean that the policy has been ironed out. All the financial and all the other administrative details have been discussed. So I would still say more kind of thought is needed before a policy becomes a policy, so to speak.
Yeah. So in normal circumstances, what you said is true. But in India, what happens is when the executive and the legislature are failing, the last recourse is the courts, the judiciary. So now most of the people are now looking at the judiciary because the executive and the legislatures, they are failing on the promises. So under such circumstances, whatever the pronouncement is given by either the High Court or by the Supreme Court in favor of the people, that is taken as a great relief. Okay, so under these circumstances, so whether that is a good, whether that augurs a good, administration in India. So that's my question.
Sir, I agree with the view that the executive and legislature have been faltering, which is why the courts get involved. But it's also true that the judiciary has had many problems of its own. But to sidestep that issue, I feel that on some of these issues, like the one we just spoke about, the judiciary probably doesn't have also the full competence, the full expert acumen that is available to the executive agencies and so on. For instance, if the Supreme Court passes this order that in the entire country, any kind of thing that is said in the press meet becomes a policy, I would imagine it to be a very big headache for governments across India. And it will also probably lead to fewer press meets, fewer kind of means of transparency and so on. So I would still say that it is best left to the agencies concerned.
Okay. So have you heard this phrase, beyond the call of the duty?
Beyond the call of duty, sir?
Yeah, beyond the call of the duty. So this is the phrase. So what do you understand by this phrase?
So as far as I understand, it means that there are some tasks that you're supposed to do because for whatever reason, whether it is you're obliged to do, whether you're supposed to do, you're expected to do. And there are other things that you do, you act upon, where you're responding to maybe kind of a higher ideal, where you say, for instance.
Yeah, Mr. SARTHAK, we can take from the context of the administration. So there are IAS officers and IPS officers who go by the rule of the law. maybe the rule books most of the times they see the rule and they say that whether it applies or not. But there are certain officers, they definitely go by the rule of the law, and at the same time they sometimes go beyond the law, in the sense when there are issues. They never think about the time they are investing. They never think that whether the work belongs to them or not. They execute it and bring happiness on the face of the other people. That's what we meant by the going beyond the call of the duty. So my question to you is, do you find any bureaucrats following this type of attitude?
So I find many bureaucrats following that attitude, and that is also, to answer the first question I was asked, that also inspires me to join the service.
Okay.
These include bureaucrats who probably stay overnight once every week in far-flung villages to understand people's concerns. These include people who teach in the local school whenever they get the time. They send their own kids to government schools, Anganwadis, and so on.
Okay.
And coming back to the administration as well, I mean, I have spoken to officers who are pretty much working more than an investment banker in Goldman Sachs, but they do not get that kind of recognition that some other people do. There's also been lots of instances of bureaucrats when the line is thin, when basically they have the discretion to basically carry out a measure, and that is mostly at the district level. They have sided with the poor. They have done things that have improved welfare at the grassroots level, and I find those instances very inspiring.
Yeah, can you give some names?
So I just read a book by Mr. Anil Swaroop, where he recounts his time in the IAS.
Yes.
And
okay. Yeah, it's okay. Mr. Sarthak, what we observed is that during the British time, there was a book called Drain of Wealth. I think you are aware who wrote this book?
Yes, Dadabhai Naoroji.
Yeah. So in this context, Mr. Shashi Tharoor gave a beautiful lecture, and he said that Britain should pay the reparations to India. So what is your view on this particular aspect?
So Dr. Tharoor's main argument was more in terms of principle. For instance, he ended his speech by saying that even if Britain gave 1 rupee per year for the next 100 years, that would be enough, because Britain would be acknowledging the kind of losses it has inflicted on the country. I do agree with that. I think the British have been remarkably reluctant to issue any kind of apology, including for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And I think it is an opportune time for the British to acknowledge whatever they have done to India, including, I think the most important thing is that one of the reasons we missed out on the industrial revolution bus, which is why we're still much less industrialized, is because of colonialism and colonial practices. And I think it would do well, even if they don't give us reparations, then I don't think India even requires reparations from the UK. We are a bigger economy than they are. I think it's important for them to issue an apology now.
Okay. In your view, Mr. Sarthak, what is the most wasted resource in India?
So I would think that it is the potential that millions of Indians who haven't had a good education and haven't had access to good healthcare, the kind of potential they carry within them, what we call the demographic dividend, for instance, I think that is what is being wasted due to our less than satisfactory policies on health and education.
Okay. Have you heard this book called Small is Beautiful?
I have heard of it, sir, but I do not quite remember in what context and what it dealt with.
Yeah, it's by E.F. Schumacher. It's on economics only.
Very old.
Yeah, that's very old. Yeah. So my question is about the Amartya Sen and Abhijit Banerjee. So these people are also talking about the human face of the development. Okay. So in India, it's a very huge country where large number of people are very poor, but we are now going for aggressive way of privatization, basing on the Western model or maybe the capitalist model. Do you think that India is now ripe to go for such a aggressive stance for privatization?
So I wouldn't favor privatization gung-ho without any thought to it. I think there are some sectors that probably would do better. with greater private participation, and other sectors that might require more state taking a greater role. But I also understand that what Messrs. Sen and Banerjee spoke about can only be accomplished by the state having more resources, and privatization obviously opens up a tap of resources for the state to invest in health, education, social welfare. So I would probably see that privatization is good in that limited sense, but only in the sectors in which it is needed the most.
Okay. So have you heard this an act called the UPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act? So that was amended in 2019. So what are the implications of the amendment overall on the society?
So one of the main kind of amendments in 2019 was that the state had the power to designate an individual as a terrorist, while earlier it could only do organizations. And the reason that was mentioned was people like Hafiz Saeed, Masood Azhar. They can be branded as terrorists now. But unfortunately, we have seen over the past couple of years that there have been many protesters and people who are evidently not terrorists. They've also been charged under this onerous provision, and we know that how difficult it is to get bail under the UAPA. So I would probably suggest, I would probably kind of hope for a lot more safeguards than what are provided under the law before you basically say that somebody is a terrorist.
Yeah. Now there is a lot of discussion on this particular 124A and this type of things. Now, what is your view? Should we keep this amendment in the act, or it should be deleted, or it should be amended? What is your view?
So I would say that I can understand the circumstances under which the state might want an individual to be declared a terrorist. For instance, one of the evidently sensible concerns the government said is that the UN 1267 committee has declared Masood Azhar as a terrorist, while we cannot under the current laws. At the same time, as I said before, I think and we can have a discussion on that as to what is the best oversight mechanism that is available to us for the state to not overreach. Coming to 124A, I mean, although we must acknowledge that the number of cases under it are paltry compared to some of the other laws in the country, some 300 odd cases in the past few years. But I think the provision is also very often misused. There are other laws to deal with people who are mischievous in this context. So I wouldn't mind even the Supreme Court striking it down as it is hearing the case.
Mr. SARTHAK, what we observed is that now there is a type of chaos in the society, and the crisis, especially the morality. The moral crisis you find more in, and in fact, somebody has coined this as the moral recession in the modern society. So tell us, what are the reasons why we got this type of moral crisis in Indian society?
So I think one of the main reasons is kind of the influx, or I mean, it was always there, but this notion of greed, of getting ahead, is evidently a capitalistic kind of, it was popularized by capitalism and in the Western countries, and it has also come to India, where everybody is kind of looking to get ahead, which is fine, but at some times they try to adopt nefarious means, which has led to the crisis of morality. Secondly, there's also been some decline in the institutions that served as a check to rampant immorality in the previous kind of times, in which case, I mean, some of them are our families, are our neighbors, are our immediate society. Our dealings with them have become severely limited now as they used to in the past, unlike what they used to be in the past. And I would think that this kind of combination of excessive greed and lack of safeguards from family, from society, immediate society, I think in combination they are leading to this immorality revolution we are seeing.
Finally, Mr. SARTHAK, what is the solution for such a problem prevalent in India? So what is the way out for this?
So ultimately, in very simplistic terms, I would think the only way this can be addressed is for the moralistic people to gain more prominence, to become more powerful, for instance, and the people who are immoral should be dealt with, whether it could be social sanctions, or in cases where they do something illegal, the law has to take its own course. But I think the most important thing is for people who do moralistic actions, they should be, I mean, their stature should go up. For instance, I was just reading yesterday about Murthy when he said that in the 80s, there was so much pressure on his company to indulge in corruption due to the license Raj, but he resisted because he said that, no, this is not how we do business at Infosys. And ultimately, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the government realized that this is somebody who wouldn't indulge in those means, and that led to his greater stature. And the people and the youth of the country look up to him. And I think that's a very positive sign.
Okay, it's very nice talking to you, Sarthak.
Thank you, sir. Same here.
Mr. Sarthak Agrawal, very good evening.
Sir.
We are heading quickly fast toward dinner time. And let's have a quick discussion on, you've been in Delhi, spent a lot of time in the central Delhi, enjoyed the vast spaces in Janpath, also the greenery, the expansive buildings and all that. Now, today you see a project called Central Vista coming up and threatening to destroy a lot of these lung space, greenery, buildings, heritage, and so on. Especially during pandemic, do you think it's prudent, good economics to spend 20,000 crores on this project? What is your take on this?
So, first of all, I would say that in the long term, we do need a bigger parliament because we need more MPs to populate the parliament, and there have been several problems faced by the existing parliamentarians. But coming up with a complete overhaul of the structure, developing new institutions, the new Prime Minister's residence near the North and South blocks, current North and South blocks, I do not know if that is the most prudent decision, because there would be cost savings, for instance, but would that be enough to compensate for everything we are losing, including our heritage buildings? It's something I'm not sure. But coming to the pandemic question, I think during the pandemic, the government was expected to put in money at the hands of the consumer. And historically, it's always been the case that during crisis, governments spend money on public works projects. So in that way, I would say it is also a good sign that money is flowing into the people who are working on these projects.
Do you think the government has been spending on, say, healthcare and education, which are really required very urgently to look at the impact on these two sectors? And also, if you see the statement made by Dr. Manmohan Singh for 30 years, education and healthcare have been neglected, and we are facing the consequences. They're quite, bad. So this government, is it doing that kind of a futuristic, more long-term investment or not?
Sir, I think over the past 3 decades, we have seen exactly the kind of thing Dr. Singh described, where health and education haven't become as big priorities. There have been some positive noises as far as the NEP is concerned, and if it is implemented well, that also means 6% of GDP being spent on education, which would be ideal. The health sector has also received a boost after the pandemic. I think it's also very much required to have a relook at where we spend the money instead of just looking at spending more money. Because, for instance, our public school teachers' salaries are 4 to 5 times higher than private school counterparts, and they do not do much better in terms of delivering learning outcomes. So I think more money is welcome, and there have been some positive noises. But yes, they should also have a relook on where the money deserves to be spent.
Okay, another controversial issue that is being discussed in Parliament and outside is the Pegasus spyware. The Snoopgate or whatever we call. Now, what is your take on this? What are the various aspects of this controversy?
So I think this is a very serious issue for 2 reasons. First of all, if it is our own government that has been involved in kind of authorizing this kind of basically phone hacking, which is a very advanced military grade spyware, then obviously some safeguards have not been followed, which deserves to be investigated. And secondly, if it is not the Indian government, but say a foreign enemy nation, that's even more critical, because the people who are involved are our court justices, are our parliamentarians, our media people. They are very important for the health of this country. So I would say either of these 2 scenarios is very threatening and deserves a proper investigation.
So is there a case for a thorough investigation and action on this, or what the government says is evading the issue for now? Correct.
So although the government has a point when it says that it hasn't been inclusively established, first of all, where these phone numbers have come from, whether all of them have been, all of these phones have been tampered with and so on. But I think in the interest of democracy, in the interest of privacy of the people of the country, I think an investigation wouldn't do any harm either to the government or to those who have been protesting against this kind of exposure.
Okay, one of the areas where a lot of growth is e-commerce. During the pandemic, a lot of e-commerce companies did very well. The government brought in a few draft rules, to rein in some of these e-commerce companies. Are you aware of them?
Yes, sir.
And what is the intent?
So the intent is to, first of all, basically regulate them a lot better than what they had been in the past, to ensure a competitive landscape for the e-commerce companies and also for the offline retailers in the country. And in terms of the kind of discounts they offer, in terms of the grievance redressal mechanisms. And there's also been this huge issue around data storage and where e-commerce companies can also store the data on customer habits and so on. And I think these are positive moves. They deserve to be regulated better than what they have been in the past.
And finally, have you been able to cast your vote? Have you become a voter?
Yes, sir.
Did you vote anytime?
So I voted as soon as I turned 18 in the 2014 Lok Sabha election. Then I didn't get a chance in the 2019 Lok Sabha, but I voted for the Haryana Assembly, I think once only.
Oh, okay. It was nice talking to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Same here. Thank you so much.
Okay, SARTHAK, this is the very first attempt, and you have come already up to the gate of the UPSC Dolpur house. It's just a matter of entering, and from there, go away to the Indian Administrative Service. I think there'll be no doubt at all about your being able to enter the Indian Administrative Service. You'll do very well. Now we'll give you our respective feedback. And at that time, if you feel like, or if you get the urge to ask a question or two, then hold on. Towards the end of the feedback, I'll give you an opportunity to seek clarifications and ask questions. Okay?
I don't want to keep you waiting for very long, sir, because I'm sure all of you are also have been at this for a long time. So I'll probably avoid any kind of clarification or questions.
Gopalgar.
Hello.
Sir, you're mute, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Now, let me start by saying that it appeared to be an interview for a lateral entry post of the Ministry of Finance in the Department of Economic Affairs. I must say that, your academic prowess is top class for your age. You are just 25, 26 and had a lot of exposure. Very good. But here we are there to essentially criticize you, not to clap, for your knowledge and experience outside the country. So the purpose of mock interview is to tell you where you have to build on your strengths. And also, if at all there are some weak areas where you can build on them and you can work on them. All right. Firstly, since you started by saying that you wanted to join the IAS to ensure that the research findings are implemented properly, now you must also, while answering, be very careful to say that this answer is based on my research finding or this answer is based on my theoretical understanding. Okay. Now, if you can't say that, I'm sure you can't say that, because at the Haryana service delivery level, you have had no research experience. You don't have any empirical data. So my first suggestion is that you must do a quick, rapid assessment. Instead of interviewers, trying to find fault with you, saying that you are a boy who has come all the way from here abroad and you want to join the administrative services without knowing the wherewithal of what happens here. Now, that is also necessary because earlier days, you were supposed to be knowing about IAS or the civil services after joining the service in the academies. But now the trend is that before you get into the service, you are expected to know what your role is going to be. So fundamentally, for a newcomer, you should know what is good governance, What are the services the government is expected to give? How is it done abroad? How is it done here? And what kind of lessons that we can learn from those services that you have observed based on your observation. So quick, rapid assessment, will help you answering the questions like the Haryana Services Bill or Maharashtra Right to Services Act, where the employees are penalized if they are not following the norms of the citizen charter. If a particular service is supposed to be delivered in 5 days, if it is not delivered, the employee is penalized. To that extent, if you absorb and then do some quick, rapid assessment of what is happening, that's all. Not a very detailed survey. Then, having worked in World Bank, the procurement procedures, the salient features, which people are not hearing these days, but then which are also now sought to be introduced once again. When I see what is happening in some states, there are different kinds of states, levels of development within the country. When it comes to procurement, whether it should be local competitive bidding or international competitive bidding or prudent shopping or pre-qualification or post-qualification, things like that are the fundamentals in procurement. Now, what is happening today in India, whether they conform to the lessons learned from these experiences from the World Bank funding and what our executives have learned from those experiences. When I said, pay for results, it's one out of such experiences. So therefore, you should be able to relate your knowledge and updated knowledge to what is happening in the field. That is two. Then when I said, payment for results, the attitude generally, in most of the countries, even in developed countries, is that people are not willing to be paid for success. People are willing to be paid for the number of hours that they have put in. Typical consultant type of seeking, rents for the services rendered. All right. So therefore, paying for results is a great challenge. It has not worked anywhere because private sector wants, because there are so many uncertainties. The flip side of it is there are so many uncertainties. You have force majeure clauses and you can't deliver what you promise. And since you can't deliver what you promise in terms of results in the medium term and long term, you can't wait for payments to be made. Therefore, they are not interested in bidding for the projects where the paying is for results. All right, that's the third. Then, my other colleagues will talk about, the freebies versus, other issues. I thought you will come back with your economics background that, there's something called public good, there's something called merit good, there's something called private good. All right. Now, you must relate your knowledge to these types of questions by saying, in my view, if you only, you have information about what is happening in, say, you talked about farmers' debt relief. Now, whether paying for the farmers' debt is the right option or not defaulting on payment of insurance premium for the crop insurance is a better option, which is going to empower, the capacity of the state to see that the benefits get transferred to those who, really deserve. That is the objective of direct benefit. It's an easy option to say that, okay, in Telangana, we give for every farmer some 10,000 rupees in 2 crops. And a landlord like perhaps me, or of course, I don't have agricultural land. Theoretically speaking, maybe if you have some 100 acres in Telangana, you are living in US, you'll get 100 acres plus 10,000 into 10,000 for 2 crop seasons. So the question is whether you are taking a tough option or an easier option, and therefore, whether you are paying for a public good or a merit good or a private good, that will satisfy the interviewer because you are relating your knowledge to the grassroots levels, whatever is happening. So my conclusion is you should get used to what is happening since you have come back only 1.5, and you are in Gurugram. You can't get exposed to these ground level realities. And you are taking a very high risk. I took economics as an optional in my civil services. I took a very high risk, but then I got a high reward because, my grassroots levels I am fixed. So therefore, try to get as much of information, collate it, as possible, so that you'll be able to apply your knowledge to the happenings. Otherwise, you are a top class potential, and you must get into the civil services. Maybe you will be like another Srivatsa Krishna of Karnataka cadre who worked in World Bank, or Indu Bhushan, who is my batchmate, who came back from ADB, and he is there in Delhi in the health sector. All right. But then I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Good.
Sarthak, I should also sound a note of caution that while I compliment and also admire your theoretical understanding of issues, uh, your distance from the ground realities is a bit concern. Uh, the way you have responded to a couple of questions gives me an impression of very heavy influence of Western liberal capital economist perspective on issues. Okay, and also when I spoke about Haryana reservation thing, you have taken a very totally one-sided view. Although I wouldn't really like to say a lopsided view, but purely a one-sided view, and you went the whole hog, justifying it. After all, in any public policy, there would be two sides to the coin. But surprisingly, you have not even touched upon the merit side of the issue. Okay. Now, the trade-off in that kind of a scenario is, just for your information, the trade-off would be that after all, when someone comes and sets up some, facility, a manufacturing unit or anything, where does he put it? He uses the, the state's particular land. He also impacts the environment, isn't it? He draws water. Okay, there's so many dimensions to a particular investment. It's not as if he comes with an investment and then he will hire brains and then create wealth and all that. Okay, he might create wealth, but ultimately he also impacts the local environment. Then in fact I did suggest that, what is the problem if there is a threshold? Already there is a threshold according to your own Haryana state law, that up to some 50,000 pay, the jobs must be given to the locals. Now, has it had any negative effect on the investment ecosystem in Haryana? Maybe there is a need for a study. We really don't know. But then, has that threshold thing, has it really detracted potential investors from coming to Haryana? Perhaps not. So therefore, my advice to you would be, instead of being very theoretical, also look at some, you know, perhaps some studies reported in magazines such as Yojana, Kurukshetra, and such like things, and also get to know a few ground realities and try to strike a balance between the various facets of an issue. Somehow it tended to look as if, if you are asked to give a solution, it would be, perfectly, suiting a regime which is bent upon a liberal Western capitalist model of economy. Perhaps uh, by virtue of your working in World Bank, your exposure to those, knowledge of giving out loans and I don't know, different kind of, and also you were also in Institute for Fiscal Studies in UK. Perhaps it looks like there is certainly some impact of whatever you have studied, whatever you have done on your understanding of Indian realities. There is a bit of a handicap, I find. So try to moderate your answers. Try and also balance out a given issue, both the pros and cons, merits and demerits, and then perhaps you should take a middle of the road approach. Okay, this just by way of a caution. Otherwise, your theoretical understanding of issues is absolutely no problem at all. Also, in certain areas, you sounded very, very general. Like particularly when I asked about the startup ecosystem, there are quite a lot of problems. These, young technocrats, they lack, problems of funding, then problems of management issues, problems of marketing. It's one thing to create, from the government side, some kind of an ecosystem, but it's quite another thing for these young technocrats coming out of IITs, NITs, to start an enterprise and also be successful. That also explains why not many startups are successful in our country. So therefore, the long-term approach to remedy the situation would also be like, if you can link it up to national education policy, where as part of educational curriculum, if you also impart entrepreneurial skills to our young boys and girls, perhaps they would also shape themselves up as future entrepreneurs. Otherwise, today, the way in the Indian scenario, in the traditional system, it's all theoretical learning, isn't it? So there is a huge gap there. So if that way, if you can connect the dots and try to give a holistic picture, probably your answers would be more composite, more comprehensive, and more middle of the road approach, rather than tending towards a particular side. There is a certain slant I see in your answers, maybe on account of your exposure to kind of theories, economic theories that you have read, and the kind of institutions that you have worked in. So they certainly do have some kind of an influence on the way you look at a problem and also provide the solutions. Okay, so maybe if you can pay some attention to what I have said, perhaps certainly you will make a better impression on the interview board, UPSC interview board. That will certainly see you through the final barrier. All the best.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Sarthak, what I observed is your knowledge base, nobody can questions. So by seeing your knowledge base, definitely the board will be very much impressed. But here it is not the knowledge which is required for a bureaucrat. Knowledge is one ingredient, but the other thing is how practically you are going to utilize knowledge for the sake of the public interest. That is the very important aspect. So the questions which are asked to you, because we know pretty well that you are not an ordinary person. You got a lot of knowledge, you got a lot of exposure, and you got a lot of higher ideas also. But the question is how they can be utilized for the betterment of the society. That's more important for us. From that perspective, we framed these questions to you. Okay, so the High Court order in the case of Delhi, so that is brought because in democracy, there are checks and balances. You are very well aware. Okay, the three wings are to be balanced. But over a period of time, the executive is emerging very, very strong at the expense of the legislature because of the majoritarianism. So those people cannot, give any voice. Whatever the executive proposes, that is being taken as the law. And so if there is no other wing like the courts, the judiciary, then people will lose faith in the democracy itself. So today, even a common person got a lot of regard towards the judiciary, because they think that even if these people are going to do some wrong, the judiciary is going to rescue. So that type of belief is there in Indian democracy, because Indian democracy is procedural democracy. It's not a substantive democracy like the UK democracy or the US democracy, where the people, they have the real right to change the governments. Here, the people are changing, but the policies are not being changed. So from the last 70 years, people are jumping from one party to the other party, but they're sustaining the same policies. It's not real change. So from that point of view, I think judiciary is a very important organ, which is now safeguarding the democratic rights. So from that point of view, I think you may think, so the checks and balances are very important. And yes, as you're right, as a policy, we should not overwhelmingly be dependent on the judiciary. Judiciary's rights, the role is very limited. But today, what happens is when both are failing, So the common man is now resorting for the judiciary, and they got a lot of faith here. So from that point of view, if the Supreme Court also passed such orders, I think the judiciary, the executive and the legislature, they will be very careful. People, before they give any false promises, like Vivek sir asked about the freebie and the welfare. So in the name of welfare, there are so many freebies are announced for the sake of garnering votes. So that type of thing can be curtailed if the judiciary is very, very strong. So that's the point why we ask this question. So coming to the reparation, this issue is brought because you are in Great Britain, and whenever we see their museums, vagera, they're full of our wealth only. The entire thing was almost looted from this country, and they are thinking that they're legitimate right, but they never said sorry for whatever these people did for a longer period. You take Australia, or maybe you take New Zealand, those people are telling sorry for the aborigines there, but that is not there. So here what we want is the wounds which are very deep in the Indian mind, they are to be solaced. You see, this will not, people will not forget. History is written very deeply into the minds of the Indians, and the Indians may not appear to be forgot the entire past, but that will not go away. So that's the reason I brought the drain of wealth. So the drain of wealth, and it's not that what these people did, they're very good things, but they're very bad things also. So from that point of view, the reparations, that issue is brought to you. The other aspect is about the UPA. So there the accountability and the responsibility of the law. That is, the executive is now using, suppose if a knife is given for the surgery, instead of going for the surgery, this knife is used for the murder. So that is the way how the things are moving on. So from that point of view, it's better not to give the knife to the person. Even if we give the knife, then there should be a lot of precautions for that. So from that angle, we have to think this aspect. Coming to the aggressiveness of the privatization, you said that money will be used for the health and education. Where is the guarantee? Is there any guarantee that the money which is saved by selling the family silver for the sake of the health and education in India? So there is no, it will be diverted. So we have got more than 32 lakh crore by way of the excise from the last 7 or 8 years. But what happened to that, nobody knows. So that's the thing we must think about. So in India, where 85% of the people are in the rural and the backward setup, so there the policies are to be more human, and the privatization we have seen from the last 30 years, in the words of Manmohan Singh, very important, crucial sectors are not being addressed. So that's the issue and concern for that. And coming to the most important problems of today, that is about the complexity of the society. Today we are in a very complex society. It is now growing because of the technological development one side, and the slackness of the social norms on the other side. So because of this thing, what happened? We got the growth of the individualism and the permissiveness. As a result, we are unable to cope up with the technological development one side, and the moral character is not growing along with the technological development. So this has become a lopsided development of the society, and that is creating a bigger problem today. So the solution for this is the morality should be given more important, and the morality should not be imposed from outside. It should be self-sustained. It should be generated on the own volition, and that should come. The coexistence of freedom and morality is the solution today, and that is to be brought so that we can have a better society. So these are the aspects which are kept in mind while asking the questions. You fairly answered certain questions, but at certain times, as Vivek sir said and Gopal sir said, you are slightly, bending, you're going, away from the roots of the Indian realities. So because of maybe your education, because of your brought up, but what we give a piece of advice, we don't compel you to think like this, but a piece of advice to you because you want to come to the bureaucrats. Because we were there in the bureaucracy for a longer period, we observed the functioning and the way it should go. So we want to give a piece of advice that be rooted to the Indian soil and think from the Indian perspective. And your knowledge with this type of perspective will definitely make you a very good material for the civil services. And definitely we want to see you will be in civil services, no doubt about it. But we want to become a very good civil servant when you come to the civil services, and wish you all the best.
Thanks so much, sir.
Yeah, I think Mr. Sarthak, you got a very detailed feedback. And I will just add, supplement by saying that, as an economist, when you look at the spending money and all that, some of these issues on Central Vista, you can look at it more holistically from the current fiscal issue, the environmental issue, the need, and all that. And then when you look at spends, government now indulge in freebies and waivers. And while we require infrastructure in health, education on a long-term basis, so I think you can take a more middle path and explain all aspects. Similarly, on this spyware issue also, I think you can look at multiple issues involved, and then I think answer without any, taking any sides. Otherwise, you can brush up on current affairs where a lot of things are happening, and you should do well. All the best.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Sarthak, when is the actual interview?
The 20th of August.
28th.
20th, 20.
28.
20.
Oh, it's 16 days, 15 days left. Okay.
Yes.
So you've had a detailed feedback. Now, is there anything you want to ask?
No, sir, I just want to thank all of you for taking out such a lot of time, first to ask questions and secondly to give such detailed feedback. I will definitely be thinking about each of these things in great detail, and hopefully I'll be able to implement these things very soon because I need to, as my interviews in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Okay, then. All the best. God bless you. Hope to see you in
Thank you,
Maharashtra.
sir. Bye-bye. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye. Thank you.